Could you survive being a slave in ancient Rome? Before you answer that question, let me paint you a picture so horrifying that it will make you grateful for living in the modern world. What you're about to discover are the most brutal, dehumanizing punishments that male slaves endured in what we often romanticize as the glorious Roman Empire. These aren't Hollywood dramatizations or exaggerated stories. These are documented historical practices that reveal the darkest side of one of history's most celebrated civilizations. Comment right now. Which punishment do you think would be the most cruel? Crucifixion? Being thrown to wild beasts? Or something even more sinister that you haven't even imagined yet? Stay with me because what you're about to learn will completely change how you view ancient Rome forever. The Roman Empire wasn't built on glory and honor alone. It was constructed on the broken backs of millions of enslaved human beings. At the height of the empire, historians estimate that between 25 to 30% of the entire population consisted of slaves. That's roughly 6 to 8 million people living in absolute bondage, with no rights, no freedom, and no hope of escape. Male slaves, in particular, faced a unique set of horrors that were designed not just to punish, but to completely destroy their spirit and humanity. The Roman legal system didn't even recognize slaves as human beings. They were classified as instrumentum vocale, literally meaning talking tools. This dehumanization wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate strategy that allowed Romans to justify the most unthinkable acts of cruelty without any moral conflict. The economic foundation of Rome depended entirely on slave labor. From the massive latifundia agricultural estates that fed the empire to the dangerous mines that extracted precious metals, from the gladiatorial arenas that entertained the masses to the domestic households of wealthy patricians, every aspect of Roman society was intertwined with the exploitation of enslaved people. Male slaves were particularly valuable because of their physical strength, but this same strength was seen as a potential threat that needed to be controlled through fear and brutalization. The Romans developed an entire science of punishment specifically designed to break the will of enslaved men while keeping them alive and functional enough to continue working. Let's start with one of the most common yet devastating punishments: flogging with different instruments depending on the severity of the offense. For minor infractions, slaves might receive lashes with a simple whip called a flagrum, but for more serious offenses, Romans used the dreaded flagrum taxillatum, a multi-tailed whip embedded with pieces of bone, metal, and sharp stones. The goal wasn't just to cause pain, but to tear flesh from the body in strips. Accounts describe how skilled executioners could flay a man alive, removing skin layer by layer while keeping him conscious throughout the entire ordeal. The psychological impact was just as important as the physical damage. Other slaves were often forced to watch these punishments as a deterrent, creating a climate of absolute terror. Even more horrifying was the punishment of ad bestias, being thrown to wild beasts in the arena. While we often think of this as something reserved for gladiators or criminals, male slaves who committed serious offenses like attempting escape or striking their masters were regularly sentenced to this fate. But here's what most people don't know. The Romans turned this into a form of twisted entertainment by creating elaborate scenarios. Slaves might be tied to posts and slowly approached by starved lions, or forced to fight bears with nothing but their bare hands. Some were covered in animal skins and hunted by trained dogs in a grotesque parody of a hunt. The crowds would cheer as these men were literally torn apart, their screams of agony providing entertainment for thousands of spectators. The punishment of crucifixion for slaves was far more common and varied than most people realize. While we're familiar with crucifixion from Christian contexts, Romans had been perfecting this method of execution for centuries specifically as a deterrent for slave rebellions. But Roman crucifixion wasn't the quick death often portrayed in movies. It was designed to maximize suffering over the longest possible time. Slaves were sometimes crucified upside down, which caused blood to rush to their heads, prolonging their agony for days. Others were crucified with their arms tied rather than nailed, which prevented the quick death that came from blood loss, instead forcing them to die slowly from exhaustion and asphyxiation. During the aftermath of Spartacus's rebellion, the Romans crucified 6,000 captured slaves along the Appian Way, creating a 130-mile corridor of rotting corpses as a warning to other potential rebels. Perhaps even more psychologically devastating were the punishments designed to strip away every vestige of masculinity and dignity. Male slaves who displeased their masters might be forced to dress as women and serve as entertainment at parties, subjected to sexual humiliation in front of crowds. Some were castrated not just as punishment, but as a way to create a permanent class of servile beings who could never threaten the patriarchal order. The practice of making male slaves compete in degrading contests, like fighting each other over scraps of food while naked, was common in wealthy households as a form of entertainment for guests. The Romans also perfected psychological torture techniques that left no visible marks but could completely destroy a man's mind. One particularly cruel practice involved taking male slaves who had formed close relationships, whether friendships, family bonds, or romantic connections, and forcing them to torture each other. A slave might be told that his son or partner would be killed unless he personally administered a brutal beating. This created a double trauma: the physical pain of being beaten and the psychological anguish of being beaten by someone you love. Many slaves preferred death to enduring this type of psychological warfare. In the mines, male slaves faced conditions so horrific that being sent there was essentially a death sentence. The silver mines of Spain and the gold mines of Dacia were notorious for their brutal working conditions. Slaves were chained together and forced to work in narrow tunnels with no ventilation, breathing poisonous gases and metallic dust that slowly destroyed their lungs. But the punishment aspect came in the form of quota systems. Slaves who failed to meet their daily extraction targets would have limbs broken or be left chained in flooded sections of the mine to slowly drown. Those who exceeded their quotas might earn an extra piece of bread, creating a vicious competition between starving men. The gladiatorial schools, which we often romanticize today, were essentially prisons where male slaves were trained to kill each other for entertainment. But the training itself was a form of continuous punishment. Gladiators were branded like cattle, lived in cells barely large enough to lie down, and were subjected to constant physical and psychological abuse designed to make them more aggressive fighters. Those who showed reluctance to fight were tortured with heated metal rods, had their eyes gouged out, or were thrown into pits with venomous snakes. The training was really just systematic brutalization designed to strip away their humanity and turn them into killing machines. One of the most insidious punishments was the practice of decimation, applied to groups of slaves. If one slave in a household or work group committed a serious offense and the perpetrator couldn't be identified, every 10th slave would be executed in an extremely brutal manner while the others were forced to watch. This created an environment where slaves were encouraged to inform on each other and prevented the formation of solidarity or resistance networks. The psychological impact of knowing that your actions could result in the torture and death of innocent fellow slaves was a form of collective punishment that poisoned relationships and destroyed trust within slave communities. The sexual exploitation of male slaves was systematic and brutal, but it went far beyond simple rape. Young male slaves were often castrated and sold specifically for sexual purposes to wealthy Romans who treated them as living sex toys. But the punishment aspect came in how sexual violence was used as a disciplinary tool. Male slaves who disobeyed orders might be gang-raped by other slaves while their masters watched, combining physical violation with public humiliation. Some were forced to participate in pornographic performances at private parties, with the threat that refusal would result in even worse punishments for their family members. The practice of exposure was another uniquely Roman form of punishment where male slaves were stripped naked and chained in public spaces, left to endure weather, hunger, thirst, and public ridicule. But Romans made this worse by encouraging citizens to abuse these exposed slaves however they wished. Passers-by could beat them, urinate on them, or sexually assault them with complete impunity. Some slaves were left exposed for weeks, developing infected sores from lying in their own waste, their bodies slowly wasting away while serving as public entertainment and a warning to other slaves. In wealthy Roman households, male slaves faced punishments specifically designed to humiliate them in front of other slaves and family members. One common practice was forced incest, where male slaves were compelled to engage in sexual acts with female relatives while the household watched. Another was competitive degradation, where slaves were forced to compete in contests of humiliation, such as being made to crawl naked through the house while barking like dogs, with the winner receiving slightly better food and the losers facing additional punishments. The Romans also developed elaborate execution methods specifically for slaves that combined elements of torture, humiliation, and public spectacle. The tunica molesta was a shirt soaked in pitch and set on fire while the slave was still wearing it, burning them alive slowly while they ran screaming through the arena. Another method involved sewing slaves into animal skins and leaving them in the sun to die as the skins contracted and slowly crushed them to death. These weren't just executions. They were designed to be so horrifying that other slaves would be traumatized into absolute submission. The psychological consequences of living under this constant threat of extreme punishment created what modern psychologists would recognize as severe collective trauma. Male slaves developed a condition that historians describe as learned helplessness on a massive scale. Many became so psychologically broken that they would turn on fellow slaves to avoid punishment, creating a system where the oppressed became complicit in their own oppression. Some slaves developed what we would now recognize as Stockholm Syndrome, becoming emotionally attached to their abusers and even defending the system that brutalized them. The long-term social consequences of this systematic brutalization extended far beyond the slave population itself. Roman society became increasingly desensitized to human suffering, viewing extreme violence as normal entertainment. Children grew up watching human beings torn apart by wild animals and thought nothing of it. This normalization of cruelty created a society where empathy became a weakness and brutality became a virtue. The very foundations of Roman civilization were built on the systematic dehumanization of millions of people. What makes these punishments even more horrifying is how they were systematized and institutionalized. These weren't random acts of cruelty by sadistic individuals. They were legal, socially accepted practices that were refined and perfected over centuries. Roman law books contain detailed descriptions of how to properly flog a slave, how long to leave them crucified before allowing them to die, and which punishments were most effective for different types of infractions. The cruelty was calculated, scientific, and completely normalized within Roman society. The documentation of these practices comes not from critics or opponents of slavery, but from Romans themselves who wrote about these punishments matter-of-factly, the same way we might write about disciplining a pet or maintaining a piece of equipment. Letters between Roman citizens casually mention torturing slaves to death, household manuals include instructions for punishing slaves effectively, and legal texts debate the finer points of how much pain is appropriate for different offenses. This casual attitude toward extreme cruelty reveals something deeply disturbing about how a society can normalize the most unthinkable acts when it stops viewing certain groups as fully human. The resistance movements that did emerge among slaves were met with punishments so extreme that they served as deterrents for generations. After each failed slave rebellion, the Romans would implement increasingly creative forms of mass torture and execution. Captured rebels weren't just killed. They were turned into public spectacles of suffering that lasted for days or weeks. Some were forced to fight each other to the death in increasingly elaborate scenarios, while others were subjected to medical experiments where Roman physicians would practice new surgical techniques on living subjects without any anesthesia. The economic efficiency of these punishment systems reveals another disturbing aspect of Roman slavery. The Romans calculated exactly how much suffering they could inflict while keeping slaves productive. They developed punishment techniques that would break a slave's spirit without permanently damaging their ability to work. A slave with a broken leg couldn't work in the fields, but a slave who had been psychologically traumatized through witnessing the torture of loved ones could still be productive while being too terrified to resist. This brings us to perhaps the most chilling realization about ancient Rome. The civilization that gave us philosophy, literature, engineering marvels, and legal frameworks that still influence us today was simultaneously committing what we would now recognize as genocide-level atrocities on a daily basis. The same Romans who wrote beautiful poetry were torturing human beings to death for entertainment. The same legal minds that created sophisticated jurisprudence also created laws that explicitly dehumanized millions of people and legalized their torture. The glorious Roman Empire, that we often admire in movies, books, and popular culture was built on a foundation of systematic human suffering that lasted for over 1,000 years. Every marble statue, every magnificent building, every engineering wonder was constructed with the blood, sweat, and broken bodies of enslaved people who lived lives of unimaginable horror. The wealth that funded Roman art, literature, and philosophy came directly from the exploitation of human beings who were treated worse than animals. This historical reality forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how we remember and romanticize the past. When we marvel at Roman architecture or praise Roman law, are we inadvertently celebrating a system built on extreme human suffering? When we use phrases like Roman virtue or Roman honor, are we ignoring the millions of victims whose suffering made that civilization possible? The gladiatorial games that we find exciting in movies represented real human beings dying in agony for the entertainment of crowds who cheered their suffering. The punishments faced by male slaves in ancient Rome represent more than just historical curiosities. They reveal the depths of cruelty that human beings are capable of when they stop viewing others as equally human. They show us how entire societies can become complicit in systematic brutalization when that brutality serves economic and social interests. They demonstrate how quickly normal people can become comfortable with extreme violence when it's presented as necessary, legal, or entertaining. Understanding these historical realities doesn't mean we should feel guilty about appreciating Roman contributions to civilization, but it should make us more conscious of the full cost of those achievements. It should make us more aware of how modern societies might be perpetuating their own forms of dehumanization and systematic cruelty. It should remind us that civilizational greatness can coexist with moral horror, and that we must always examine what lies beneath the surface of societies that claim to represent human progress and achievement. The male slaves who suffered these punishments in ancient Rome were real people with names, families, dreams, and fears just like us. They felt pain exactly as we would feel pain. They experienced terror, despair, and hopelessness in ways that we can barely imagine. Their suffering was not abstract or distant. It was immediate, personal, and absolutely real. By understanding their experiences, we honor their memory and commit ourselves to ensuring that such systematic dehumanization never happens again in any form, anywhere in the world.